Good evening, everyone. My name is Robbie Sassoon. I'm the director of Crossroads, Jerusalem. To briefly introduce Crossroads, Crossroads is a small nonprofit organization committed to the support of English-speaking teens and young adults in Israel. As we believe, every teen and young adult deserves the support to reach their potential and thrive. These services include free therapeutic support, crisis intervention, educational support, employment support, and enrichment programs. We're based in Jerusalem, although we've opened services in a number of communities, including Beit Shemesh, Hashmonaim, and we're beginning to open a branch in Efrat. Recently, as we were doing a needs assessment in Efrat, the topic of mental illness amongst teens and suicidality and suicide came up. And we realized it'd be a really important topic to offer a session to the community so people could walk away feeling a little bit more informed, supported, with more resources. Our goal at Crossroads is to help teens and young adults any way we can. So if you know someone who may be in need of support, feel free to be in touch with us. We're going to share in the chat box, some of our basic information and services. I think the significant registration of this event speaks to what many of us know, and frankly, what we see almost every day at Crossroads. That mental health challenges and suicidality amongst teens is unfortunately on the rise. My hope is that this event will give more support, information, to parents, the most significant people in kids' lives. We're really blessed tonight by having three amazing mental health professionals, leaders in each of their fields, and each of them very close partners to Crossroads. Caryn Green, a social worker, the founder and former director of Crossroads, and now the founder of Jerusalem Counseling. Caryn is beyond a talented social worker and therapist, and we're super lucky to have her with us as I try and include her in any time we put a conference together, because she's really fantastic. Valery Hazanov, a psychologist, the clinical director of Headspace. I also want to acknowledge Headspace for co-sponsoring this event. Headspace, an amazing program offering free short-term therapy in Jerusalem. Valery headlined our Masa conference this year and was spectacular and truly wise, and a very human professional. Lastly, Jennie Goldstein, a psychiatrist whose reputation precedes her. And as busy and as successful as she is, she's always made the time for a quick consult and always been very supportive of any of the needs that we've had at Crossroads. Both working in private practice and now runs the Child Psychiatry unit at Shaare Zedek. I want to thank the entire Crossroads staff, with a special shout out to Deborah, who runs our Beit Shemesh SNF and who's now starting our Efrat branch. On that note, Deborah is the host of the evening, and any questions that you have during the open panel slot should go directly to Deborah. You'll only have an option to communicate with the host, and you should send your questions to Deborah. Briefly, the structure of the evening will be three short presentations, Valery, Caryn, and then Jennie, after which we'll open up the panel to questions. Again, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please send it to Deborah in the chat, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Lastly, I just wanted to take a moment and acknowledge everyone that came tonight. As it shows, your commitment to your kids and to our community. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for this really meaningful conversation. And I'd like to invite Valery to begin.
Thanks very much, Ruby. Thank you, Caryn and Jennie. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Crossroads. And thanks everyone who joined us today on this obviously very concerning issue. I want to start a little bit with stats, just to talk about this phenomenon in terms of numbers. And maybe my first message to you and to myself is that suicide among teens is an extremely rare phenomenon in Israel and elsewhere. So despite the fact that in the past decade or so, researchers saw across the globe an increase in that phenomenon, as Robbie mentioned, and some people think even in the tens of percent, still in Israel, in the past decade or so, we're talking about, I'm talking on, let's, in general, there are around 400, 420, depends on the year, of course, successful suicides a year among teenagers, which is even young adults, teenagers, young adults, people who comprise the age of 0 to 24, they comprise around 10% of that number. So we're talking about 40 people a year until the age of 24. And in that age bracket, if you go a little bit lower to under 18, we're talking about somewhere around 3 to 4 people out of 100,000 kids and teenagers. Of course, every person that commits suicide, every teenager, every child is an extreme and unthinkable tragedy. But in terms of the phenomenon at large, it is still, thank God, a very, very rare event. And I think it's important to understand because I think in the background, we always have that fear, definitely as clinical professionals, but also as parents, what if? So this is just to allay a little bit maybe of that fear and to say that it's extremely rare. However, it does happen. And I think one of the things that my kind of short introduction is to, can we know in advance when that happens? Are there any triggers? What should we know as parents? What should we know as clinicians? The leading probably suicide researcher in the world, Matthew Nock, who I had the pleasure of meeting several years ago in New York and who works at Harvard, claims, and his research claims, that clinicians are as good as chance in guessing who out of their clients will commit suicide. And in that regard, clinicians and parents or just lay people are pretty much in the same boat, meaning it's extremely hard to know who among the people, even if they're admitted, let's say, to an emergency room, to a psychiatric emergency room, who out of the people you see will actually, in fact, commit suicide. It's an extremely difficult thing to prophesize and to guess. However, we know that out of the amount of people who do commit suicide at the end, 95% of those had, in fact, severe psychopathology preceding. It doesn't just happen, typically. And it's true that we see suicidality as a general phenomenon, not only the suicide itself, but also like suicidal thoughts. And when we think about suicidality on a scale, we can think about it as a larger phenomenon that many of us, maybe all of us, have some personal reference to. Many of us, if not all of us, had suicidal thoughts. But between a suicidal thought and a committed, successful suicide, there's a very large gap. So I'm looking at the time now. I'm good, Ruby?
Yep.
Yes. The number one psychological distress or psychological area of suffering that is connected to suicide is, of course, depression. And I think the number one thing that a clinician will look to is the severity of the depression. But I think in teenagers, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today, that picture can be a little bit different because the depression, as we think about it, as someone who's very sad, is not necessarily the way it manifests itself for teenagers. It can manifest itself in anger, in irritability. But the main thing I would like to say perhaps and finish with this is that as parents or as close ones to people we are concerned for, I think the main thing for us is to look for changes, for shifts, for sudden significant changes in the for our teenager, and to try and connect and talk about what's going on. And one last thing I would say is that, you know, there is this myth, I don't know if you share it or not, or if you've heard of it or not, that if you talk about suicide or suicidality, it increases the chance of it happening in reality. Well, it is a myth. In fact, the opposite is true. So what I would encourage parents and people who are concerned about someone is, yes, in fact, to talk about it. And if you are in fact concerned about suicidality, don't afraid to use that word, because using that word and putting it out there on the table does not, that's an emphatic no, from clinicians and researchers, increase the risk of in fact suicide. What it does do, it validates potentially the feelings that some very suffering people around us might have, and it might be very, very helpful to them. So I think I will end with that, and we'll move to the next panelist, and we can obviously talk about some of the things I mentioned in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if there could have been a better segue for me. I'm gonna take the reins now, if that's okay, Robbie, right?
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm actually talking specifically about what Valery just ended with. What does it mean to talk about suicide? What is it called? What does it mean to think about suicide? So I'm going to look at it from kind of a different perspective, taking sort of what Valery said and moving from it. What does it mean if we talk about it? Where do we go with it? How do we understand it? I'm going to kind of remove the drama a little bit, maybe not to disrespect the seriousness of the topic, but to be able to understand like what's underneath it. Where does it come from? You know, we read signals off of each other all the time. Let's say you walk in the front door and you look flustered and your partner says to you, without saying anything, without you saying anything, your partner looks at you and says, hey, can I get you a cup of tea? Right? You didn't have to say, I am flustered, and then have the person look at you and say, oh, let me help you because you're flustered. We read each other's subtext all the time, that when I say this sentence, what actually I mean is what's underneath it. So you make dinner and you finish making dinner and you say, God, I'm exhausted. And you hope that your partner will say, okay, you know what? Let me do the dishes. You didn't say to them, I need you to do the dishes because I feel this way. So I want to really be clear that when people are talking about suicide or death or killing themselves, it is not necessarily those words that are the words that you want to grab onto, and certainly not to be afraid of them. And I'll talk about that again in just a second. So just like Valery said, that I want to stress that if I was in a room with you, I would have all of you repeat after me the words suicide, killing myself, I want to die, because those are words that are just horrifying. In the 80s, every film that came out had a scene where there were people sitting around the table and they would say, did you hear about cousin Joe? He's got cancer. And you would whisper the word, because God forbid we would all get cancer just by saying it. That is not the case at all, right? The more you say it, the easier it is to hear, and it doesn't become this like crazy upsetting thing that's happening. When I train non-clinical staff to deal with suicide in the gap year programs or in the summer programs, the first thing I say to them is that this is not on you. Anytime anybody says anything about death or suicide or I don't want to be here anymore, we take it very seriously. But the only thing I ask them to do is to go into a room that's a safe space with this person. And I tell them, I need you to ask 2 questions. So they say to them, I'm here for you and I'm going to be here for you until we figure out how to help you. I have 1 question or 2 questions I need to ask you. Do you want to close your eyes and poof, not be here anymore? Or do you want to kill yourself? That's it. right? So we're breaking it down between passive talk, passive thoughts, and active. A high percentage of the time within the population of teens who are in the normal spectrum, right, whatever normal is, but not with obvious serious mental health factors, the answer is the former. It's the passive one, right? It's most of the time where kids come in here to my office, it happens all the time, right? And they say, yeah, I've thought about it, but I would never do it, right? And that is most kids. If you have a conversation with your friends, you're going to find that a lot of them had thoughts about dying, about not waking up, about, you know, all these kinds of things. This is part of being a teenager. And more than the majority, most kids who are in those years do think about it at some point or another, right? So we're not talking about when somebody says, oh, you know what, I thought about dying, or I imagine that I was in a car wreck, or, you know, I just want to go to sleep. I can't deal with this anymore, right? We think about it. We say it. It's part of who we are. So so broadly speaking, the passive side, which is parasuicide, can be defined as a non-fatal self-injury or non-suicidal self-injury. So it's a passive gesture or a suicidal gesture. It's when somebody who's distraught makes threats or gestures that other people perceive as suicidal behavior. However, these individuals do not intend to die, right? There's a lot going on in this age group that does not necessarily mean I'm wanting to commit suicide, or I want to die right now. And yet the gestures that they make are harsh and scary, right? But they are not, that is not their intention. It's in fact, communicate distress. That's the biggest thing I could say. Communicate distress, and it's a cry for help. We talk about that a lot. Like what is it? Oh, they're just trying to call for help, right? But don't poo-poo that. It's true. They're looking to tell you something is wrong. If it's a sublethal drug overdose or cutting, right? These gestures are not well-kept secrets for most kids, especially these days. Most things aren't secretive these days. With all of the social media, secrets have gone to the wayside. But in general, they don't do it to keep it a secret. Somebody knows. Somehow they know about it. Somebody does. Or they do something and then they call somebody and say, hey, I did this. I'd say 90% of the kids who came into my office this year and said, you know, I was cutting and then I went and I told my mom. Or I'll say, does anybody else know about it? And their first reaction is, oh yeah, I told my parents, right? So it's not necessarily something that's done behind closed doors in a secret. Sometimes it is, right? But sometimes it's not. So let's understand more clearly what is passive suicidal ideation. And ideation is another way of saying thinking. So passive suicidal ideation is defined as a wish to die, thinking about one's own death, or that one would be better off dead in comparison to active suicidal ideation, which refers to thoughts of killing yourself, right? That's the clear difference between active and passive. In a personal essay for Outline, Anna Borges writes, right now, I don't actively want to kill myself. I don't have a plan. I don't check the majority of the boxes on lists of warning signs of suicide. I have a life I enjoy and I'm curious about the future. But the fact remains, I don't always feel strongly about being alive. And sometimes, on particularly bad days, I truly want to die. She calls passive suicidal ideation the gray area, fleeting between thought and attempt. So let's take a step back for a second and look at what is active suicidal ideation, just for a moment. It's when they have lost their last bits of hope and or seen no way to end their suffering, have thoughts of suicide or self-harm, and have developed plans to carry it out, possibly even attempting it. It's a direct thought, not fleeting, of wanting to actively end their life, making active plans of how, when, where, and gathering items that they need to carry out the plan. The chances of that actually happening where all of those things are together are really very rare, right? Especially in what we see. Active suicidal ideation is acting on it. It's the active part, right? It's not just thinking about it. That's why therapists will ask if the person has a plan, and if they have the means to do it, then it's our obligation to report, right? If somebody's going to hurt themselves or someone else, we report. We get that person to the hospital, right? With teenagers, I hope to do it with them, right? I want them to make the phone call with me. I want them to agree to help themselves. But it is something that when you see it, you have to act on it. This part, however, is not that while that part is black and white, there are parts of it that aren't. Once the person is living in a place of thinking actively of suicide, the risk is definitely higher than if they aren't thinking about it regularly. And the fact is that talking about suicide and being ready to have a plan to do it. I had a kid who came into my office for a year, and every week she told me a different plan that she had. And eventually it became this thing where it desensitized both of us to the idea of her doing it, and it allowed her to move past it. Right? So so now we're going to go back to where the shades of gray are. Shades of gray are the passive suicidal ideation. It's thinking about it passively. While active suicidal ideation gets an enormous amount of attention, right? And for good reason, right? Passive suicidal ideation often doesn't get the right kind of help. First, suicide exists in a highly stigmatized place, right? Nobody wants to talk about suicide. God forbid we say it. It's everyone here will say it. And Valery said it very clearly. Saying the word suicide isn't a bad word. It's not bad. It is something that happens in the world. And the more we allow it to be this secret word that nobody talks about, the more power we give it. Any mention of it understandably raises concern and possibly interventions by loved ones. But it's not necessarily something that you want to jump on to have like an immediate intervention about. Because what that does possibly is stigmatize people for having those thoughts, right? So it's a normal response to life stressors, and B, it deserves open and honest conversations about it. So mentioning that their despair is a time to listen, try to understand what we spoke about earlier, and what's underneath it. Like what is going on with them that they are thinking about it. And oftentimes it takes them a little while to say it, but just being there and listening is part of what will get you there. And if you can't get there with them, that's when you go get help. Let's look at uncovering the various ways in which suicidal ideation can manifest. It can be feeling like you don't have another way to make the pain stop, or hopelessness about the future. It can be indifference about life. Kids will talk a lot about feeling numb, or hope that an accident or a disease will just take it out of your hands. I had somebody who talked about suicide in a way, but would never ever do it. And what he would talk about is that idea that like, maybe somebody else will make it happen. Like maybe something else will just come in and kind of take me away, right? So, we didn't really talk about it. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but there are things that are out there today that are big causes of kids feeling hopeless and powerless. Cyberbullying, bullying, I don't call it social anxiety. I call it socially anxious kids who don't know how to talk to one another, communicate, be with one another, low self-esteem in the social arena, and general anxiety and depression, of course. And those things bring on thoughts of suicide. How am I doing? 2 minutes? 3 minutes? 2 minutes. Okay. So people who are experiencing passive suicidal ideation should get help. I really believe that when you are able to get your child to go to somebody else, it's the best thing you could do for them, because talking to you about it, they have to see it in your eyes every day, right? When they can only talk to you about it, then they feel that they're burdening you. They feel that they don't want you to see that part of them, right? It's a hard thing to have to stand in the position of parent and mental health person. So please don't hesitate to get your child to go talk to somebody else who doesn't have any skin in the game, right? That person's just going to sit there and talk. So, you want, the one big thing I have to do now that I'm running out of time, the big thing I want to say about dealing with kids who are thinking about it a lot, I want to leave you with the word connection. Connection. If they are connected to you, if they are connected to people, to places, to things, if they are connected, it keeps them tethered in this world. And that is what we want to help them with. We want to help them connect. We want to let them be seen, right? Not felt sorry for, understand, validate, be able to allow them time to really understand that their thoughts are okay, right? And the point is that you're hurting and I see it and we need to figure this out together. So when they are thinking about these things, it's okay. Don't run and call the ambulance. If you get help, call the hotline. Iran is the hotline. It's 1201, 1201. It's a hotline. You can call it, they can call it, right? It does exist. So if you have a question in the moment and you can't get to a therapist, then there are people that you can speak with who are going to help you through it or help your kid through it. Self-care is really important to help these kids learn how to take care of themselves. It's like, I liken it to teaching a child how to self-soothe when they're trying to go to sleep as babies, right? We need to learn how to do self-care. Most people don't do it well when they're adults. You want to focus on it for a kid who's in trouble. You really want to help them learn what self-care is. And you want to try to help them figure out what their supports are and remind them of it all the time. So to end, I guess I can talk later during the panel part about how I would speak to the kids. But one of the things I would say is the most important thing for me as a therapist to give over to you is to just take out the drama. There's no need to get upset and get into their drama with them. Listening is just that. It's just put your ears up and let them in. And whatever it is they're saying to you, do your best to just take it in, take a deep breath, and keep moving forward. That is what they need. If you get stressed out, if you get dramatic, then it makes them feel like there's something wrong. So as hard as it is, you want to kind of really remind yourself to take a deep breath, listen, and then get help. But majority of the time it's passive. It's not active. There's a lot of talk about it. And we want to figure out what that means, right? Where is it coming from? I guess I will hand it over to Jennie.
Okay, thank you. Just before Jennie, thank you, Caryn. I also want to add that Crossroads has a hotline for teens.
Yeah, exactly.
050 hotline. I put it into the chat. We tried to put some services in the chat box before. I'm going to put it shortly in terms of our general services. Also, anyone that hasn't had a chance to send a question yet, feel free to send Deborah questions in the chat. Deborah, the co-host, questions in the chat. Okay, Jennie, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. I would like to address how we help the rest of the children, the ones who are not suicidal, the ones who are not demonstrating warning signs of suicidal danger, but who are living in a world where suicide is a reality. The 15-year-old who hears in B'nai Akiva that her friend's brother committed suicide. The 14-year-old whose classmate was hospitalized after a severe cutting episode. And really also included in this group is the 16-year-old whose high school auditorium is decorated with pictures of graduates who were killed defending Israel's borders, and the 13-year-old whose best friend's father was killed in a pigua. How do we help these children who are not directly suffering from depression or trauma, but who are growing up in a world where we cannot possibly shield them from these child-unfriendly experiences? Typically, the bracha we wish parents of a newborn baby include the words simcha, health, Torah. A future wedding reference is usually thrown into. But if I were writing the official traditional bracha text, I would choose one word: resilience. May your child be blessed with resilience. Resilience is defined as the capacity to rise above difficult circumstances. It is the trait which allows us to face adversity with optimism. This trait of resilience has been researched and studied. We believe that some people are genetically loaded with a tendency toward greater resilience. But we also believe that parents can nurture and develop resilience in their children. I would like to review with you a suggested summary of the ingredients needed to nurture resilience in your child. Though we cannot offer any tips tonight about how to shield your child from adversity, this list will empower you to prepare your child to face adversity and not just survive it, but grow from it. If you actively invest in nurturing your children's resilience, then when you sit down with them to talk about suicide and to talk about mental illness or war or sexual abuse and all those topics which often leave parents feeling so insecure, you can feel empowered, knowing that your children are already fortified with the foundation of resilience needed to cope. I am going to describe suggestions about what to already have pumping through the emotional pipelines of your home before the crisis hits, so that you and your children are already set up to navigate the unavoidable challenges of life together. So what are these ingredients? What is the recipe for resilient children? In 2006, the American Academy of Pediatrics published the 7 C's of resilience, described by Dr. Kenneth Ginsberg at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. For those who are interested in further reading on the issues I will touch upon, you can check out, for starters, 2 books, Building Resilience in Children and Teens by Kenneth Ginsberg and Mindset by Carol Dweck. The 7 C's. Number 1, confidence. The best way to build confidence in a child is to constantly shower them with unlimited praise, right? Actually, not true. Constant praising creates a sense of anxiety in children. Carol Dweck explains that by praising kids in a more thoughtful way, that is, for their hard work, their strategies, their focus, their perseverance, kids learn to appreciate challenge and to not fear the process. Praising talent instead of process, as in, wow, you're so smart, or look how you got that answer so quickly, makes kids vulnerable and in need of constant reassurance. Praising talent diminishes their belief in their success. They think, if I don't succeed now, I will not succeed tomorrow, because I must not be as talented or as smart or as good as my teachers or my parents think I am. To nurture confidence, focus praise on the hard work, not on the outcome. Number 2, competency. Teach children to value being thorough, being skilled, not just getting by. Children can sense mediocrity and will be stronger for having been taught that being competent takes investment. Number 3, connection. Of course, Corona lockdowns were extremely stressful in so many ways, but many families found that the together time which was forced upon them created stronger bonds between parents and children and allowed parents to connect with their children in ways they had not before. Children thrive by feeling connected to adults who love them and believe in them. Those connections require time and planned focus. Plan that time. It may feel artificial, but connections can't happen without work. Number 4, character. Do not be afraid to talk to your kids about right and wrong, about justice. Children benefit from having clarity about what their parents value. And of course, our children watch us and learn from us. They develop a keen sense of morality by hearing us grapple with how to be moral. When appropriate, narrate your own moral dilemmas out loud with your children to help them develop character. Number 5, contribution. Routinely being on the giving end allows us to feel more secure when unusual life circumstances throw us onto the receiving end. Encourage your kids to find opportunities to be creatures of contribution, not just when school curriculum requires it, and not only because chesed is a virtue, but because being a contributor builds resilience. Do not be humble at home. Share aloud the ways in which you, as a parent, are contributing to society. Allow your children to hear you articulate that it is not always easy for you or convenient for you to give to society, but that you do it anyway. For children, and especially for teenagers, being contributors also catapults them into being community stars. Thank God, we live in a community where volunteers are a subcategory of superhero. Teenagers who contribute will amass a lot of positive feedback, which increases self-esteem, and increased self-esteem increases resilience. Number 6, coping. To fortify your child's coping mechanisms, take a close and perhaps uncomfortable look at your own coping skills. What are you modeling for your own child? What they see is a major factor in what they do. Do you respond to frustration with angry outbursts or blaming others? Taking care of yourself will make you a better role model of coping for your children. If you are dysregulated in your responses to challenge, seek help so that you can model constructive ways to express pain and disappointment and frustration. Conversely, believing gam zu l'tova or hakol mishamayim, meaning all is for the good or all is from God, well, of course, that's very laudable faith, but it is also important for us to model for our children genuine frustration, to express our disappointment, and to articulate our own struggles. If children only see stoic acceptance in your coping toolbox, they will likely feel shame for experiencing anger or disappointment. And that shame is the explosive fuel of harmful coping mechanisms. Finally, number 7, control. If we train kids to believe that life happens to us without us having any control over our fate, it is hard for them to thrive in good times and unavoidable that they will crash in hard times. Kids need a sense of control to feel safe. Parental discipline provides structure. Rules in a home do not remove control, they guide and protect children and train them in the thinking process of how to develop control over their own behaviors. Explaining what our reasoning is behind our rules and devising a family culture of earned trust over time, and when age appropriate, can strengthen children's sense of control over their own lives. Discipline in a home does not imply powerless children. Keep dialogue open while maintaining and preserving parental leadership. Dialogue with our children and respectful listening to their questions will not dilute your parental authority and will help them develop healthy thinking patterns for the future when they will be solely responsible for their own choices. In summary, the main themes reflected in the 7 C's reflect 2 major points. Number 1, there is no avoiding it. Our children watch us and they learn from us. The bad news is, well, that is the bad news. You are always a source of inspiration for your children. That's a lot of pressure. But the good news is we can also show our children that mistakes are okay, apologizing is okay, and growing and improving is a journey we are all a part of, adults and children alike. Number 2, An African proverb teaches, smooth seas do not make skillful sailors. For children to be resilient, we must allow them to experience frustration, challenge, and yes, even and especially failure. Okay, Robbie, I turn it back to you.
Okay, great. I want to repeat that anyone who has questions should send them to Deborah Hefes in the chat. Jennie, there was a number of requests if you could share the authors and the books in the chat. If you can't do it directly, do it through Deborah or me.
Sure.
Let me see if I could, what happens if I add, oh, great, look how fancy. Okay, super. So we're now going to begin asking a number of questions to the panelists. Again, more questions. Should be sent to Deborah. First of all, that was like super meaningful overview in so many different ways. So thank each of you. I'm going to put the first question out. Is suicide something you should talk to teens about preemptively? Or is there a risk in introducing this it as an option they may not have thought of beforehand?
I don't think there's ever, I mean, first of all, I don't think you have to talk about suicide with kids. I don't think it's something that you know, like it's like saying, you know, do you want to talk about a terrorist incident because it might happen, or a car accident because it might happen? I think that it's relevant if they know somebody who is suicidal, or they know somebody who committed suicide, or it's relevant if they aren't feeling good and they're feeling like they're talking about death, and then you want to sit with them and talk to them about, you know, what it means. But there's a concept called thought action fusion. It's when you take a thought and you think that you fuse it with the action. Like if I say my mother has cancer, it does not in any way mean that my mother will get cancer just because I said it, right? So if you think as hard as you can that for me to fall off my chair right now, it's not going to happen. In the same way, if we say the word suicide, it's not going to create a suicidal situation, right? And there's nothing that we say that they aren't getting on social media. Everything is talked about on social media, everything. Suicide, anorexia, you name it, it's there. If your kids are asking about it, or they're curious about it, or they, right, there's nothing wrong with sitting down and having a talk about it with them. It's certainly, nothing could be bad to do that. What do you guys say?
Well, I think I would add, though, that if there's a community tragedy where it is being talked about, it's helpful if parents bring it up, specifically in a community where something has happened and the kids know it has happened, because it shows them that you're not afraid to talk about it. If you wait for the signal from them that they want to talk about it, what they're seeing is mom's afraid to bring it up. So if there's something going on in the community, I would suggest that you say, hey, I heard what happened in so-and-so's class or in so-and-so's family. Do you want to talk about it? So that they see that you're open to the conversation. Otherwise, they won't come to you.
Valery, did you want to add anything?
Only a minor point. I think, first of all, I agree with Caryn and Jennie. I think that's the approach. The minor point is that in therapy, I don't necessarily talk with everyone, even in intake, about suicide, if it seems completely irrelevant. So same with kids in that regard. Like, but what Jennie's saying, I think, is very important, that connects to what Caryn was saying in her talk, I think, is that you don't want to make it a thing you don't talk about because everyone is afraid to talk about it. I think that is more dangerous than discussing it and as open as we can. Wait.
Just to follow up about that. And frankly, one of the unfortunate reasons why we thought about doing this event is because in the last number of weeks and months, there was a number of suicides. So there was a question that put out there, which was, how do I help my teenager deal with the suicide of a friend? And then in parentheses, especially when they say, I'm fine, don't worry.
So, following up to what I was saying before about modeling for our kids, I think it's okay to say, it was so sad for me to hear that, or wow, their family must be going through such a hard time. Again, to narrate these things, because as we know, when kids say I'm fine, it means leave me alone, I don't want to talk about it. And if we can model for them how to articulate feelings without saying to them, so now tell me how you feel, just putting it out there so that they hear it, you're giving them examples of what it means to share hard feelings without any pressure. And they hold on to that model.
And I also think, it's okay to be curious and have a discussion, like ask questions. Did you know him or her? And, do you know anyone who does know him or her, right? It's okay to have just a conversation. It doesn't have to be the conversation with the big T. It can really just be, hey, how's everybody doing? Because you have younger siblings. It's this, you're going to know more about this person. So you can ask about the younger siblings, the older siblings, the parents, right? When something happens like this, the whole family is affected. The whole community is affected, and everyone's affected in a different way. And I think another thing to just note that's really important is that everybody deals with tragedy in a different way. You want to let them know that they get to deal with it. So even if, taking off what Jennie said, that your child knows somebody in the community who committed suicide, and there are some kids who are like beyond themselves and are crying all the time and can't go to school, but they don't feel that way. You need to make sure that you say to them, everybody's got a different way of dealing with tragedy and dealing with suicide and death in general. And whatever your way is fine. There's no prescribed way to deal with death, right? Everybody has to go through it themselves. And if you don't feel that close to that person, that's okay. If you're just sad a little bit, but you move on with your life, that's okay, right? We have to make sure that we, whatever their reaction is good and true, and that's what it should be, and nothing more and nothing less.
Valery, did you want to add anything?
I think the world is a very complex place, and suicide is a very complex issue. So I will talk about suicide the same way I would talk about anything that's complex, unfair, and sad. So it's the same thing. I don't think there's something special about suicide, right? I mean, anything that's difficult is difficult to talk about. Same as suicide.
Okay. This question may be possibly the most relevant question of the most relevant questions of the evening, because it doesn't only apply to a child, but it applies to the whole peer group of a child, which is how do I help my child support their friend, boyfriend, girlfriend when they are suicidal or when they are self-harming or hospitalized? How do I help my child from feeling responsible for their friend's mental health?
I think that, for me, what I do with kids, and I stress with staff of programs too, is that you always want to let your kid know that listening is the best thing they can do, and that they don't have to take responsibility for anything, that we listen to each other, we listen to our friends, but we also can let our friends know when this is hard, right? They are allowed to say to their friend, even though their friend is the one that's going through it, to say, wow, this is so hard. I feel so heavy from this, or I feel so sad from this. Like, I need to kind of get a break. You want to, like Jennie was saying, you want to tell them what sentences you might use so they can vibe off of it and make it their own. And they can then go and sit with their friend. But the most important thing I think that we have to tell our kids is, you're not responsible. As seductive as it is to be the person that your friend goes to tell you this heavy, sad, dramatic information, and it's seductive. It makes them feel so important. You want to remind them that putting up a boundary is the most important thing they can do. Make sure that they're taking care of themselves, that they're talking to another friend about it or with you guys, and to let them know, like, it's never your responsibility, right? That person's going to go get help, and there are adults out there to do that.
And I think also going back to what I was saying about discipline in the house and rules in the house and parental authority, the more children feel that their parents are there taking care of them, by setting guidelines and really staying in parent role, the more comfortable they'll feel turning to you when they're feeling overwhelmed by something, because they see you as someone who's there to protect them and who keeps them safe and sets limits for them. And part of the limit setting in that conversation can be the very classic line that kids need to hear and over and over again: a secret is a bad thing. So if someone says to you, please don't tell this to anyone, and your gut tummy is telling you this feels huge, come to me. Tell me, we'll talk about it. If your friends tell you a secret that feels scary to you, you can tell me and we'll figure out together what to do to keep you safe and your friends safe. And if this is part of the structure that the kids feel from their parents, it'll serve them well when that crisis comes up. We all know so many stories of the way a kid was saved, either in a case of sexual abuse or in a case of suicidal intent, was that they told a friend and the friend went to the teacher, went to the mechanechet, went to a parent and got the kid help. I would say most of our stories are like that. Through a friend, the child gets help. So they need to feel that safety by hearing from us that secrets are bad.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, because I think that suicidality is so much about isolation and the opposite of sharing. And I think here the important thing is to never stay with things like this by yourself. So I really connect to that, and it resonates with me. It's too big of a responsibility to carry on yourself, and I think it's probably it's the opposite of what needs to happen when someone feeling suicidal and down. What needs to happen is the opposite of, again, of isolation and being closed and secretive and by yourself. The more connection can happen, the better it is. So I connect with that.
Okay, I would just add to that. In many situations, your child's friend may put pressure on them not to share. And there's deliberate or not, there's they're feeling stuck in terms of what to do. And what we discuss with our staff and what we tell any clients at Crossroads who bring this to us is that the number one thing you could do to help is to share, is to share with others. And that really transcends, frankly, what may be gained by not sharing in almost every way. Okay. How do you approach a teen? Let's say, how do you approach a depressed teen who does not like talking about their emotions and gets angry when a parent tries to discuss emotions?
Jennie?
I'm just smiling because I think you just described teenagers. So why? When we say how to approach them, you leave them. You don't have to force kids to talk about their feelings, and you watch for functioning. If you see them functioning, then we can count on that things are okay. If you see signs of kids shutting down, of them disappearing from activities that they typically would show up for, of them being more and more shut in their room and without attachment to friends, that's when we start worrying. The door closed 20 hours a day is a problem. And it's fair to say to kids, this is unacceptable. We need to see you. But that doesn't mean we need to talk to you and hear everything going on in your brain. That's very, as the kids would say, chofer and annoying. But presence and connection, as all of us use that word in our talks, the connection that we can ask for and demand visually. But more than that, I think you're going to end up just pushing them away until they hit 20 and become normal humans again.
And you have all kinds of 20-year-old problems. I agree. I don't think it's about them talking to you about their feelings. There's this thing in society that we're taught as parents that we should be able to talk about our feelings with our kids. So I think there was a question about how do we sort of let our kids know that they can talk to us. But I think that's everything that Jennie's been saying is if you talk to them and they're hearing you, then you need to count that as talking, right? Remember, it's not always talking and receiving talk back. Sometimes it's just talking and hearing yourself talk to them and having them hear you talk to your friends. and help your friends or help somebody out, you're role modeling. You're modeling for them, what they can do, and they're taking it all in. Kids take everything in. So if you're helping a friend in need and they might say to you, what was wrong with so-and-so? Tell them, right? Say, she's not feeling well. She's really down or has, she's feeling a little depressed. So I was trying to help her just by listening and talking and letting it through. And don't be worried about saying, if you get to a point where you figure out that your kid is, might want to talk to somebody, it's not a bad word. Therapist is not a bad word. You can say, hey, would you be interested in talking to someone? And if they say, no, what are you talking about? That's fine. But you would be surprised how often a teenager wants to talk to somebody who's just theirs, right? They just want to be looked at in the eye and given a space where they can just be themselves. So it is remarkable how many times a teenager would say, yes, I want to talk to somebody who's not you. And that's fine, right? But like Jennie said, you don't have to force it, right? Just watch your kids. When Jennie said, watch your kids, that means watch your kids. They should not feel invisible in their own homes. And if they do feel invisible because they're really good at it, you should still let them know that you see them. I see that you're going to your room. I see that you're not talking, right? Just letting you know, I see you.
I feel the need to, maybe validate how difficult it is for parents when their kids are like that, and how incredibly frustrating, and sometimes it leads to, I think, a sense of personal failure as parents. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, and maybe even to express it in some way to the team, and to kind of allow them to, if you wish to do so, to behave the way they behave, but maybe to communicate to them that it's incredibly difficult for you when someone is not talking to you or slamming doors or all the things that we know teenagers do. I think they can know that it's actually pretty hard.
This is connected, and it may have been related to already, but I'm going to say because it's important. Someone asked, how can we build mutual trust with our teens so they feel comfortable speaking about difficult topics with us? It may be a little bit of an overlap, but I'm going to frame it as its own question.
I think it's trust is a lifelong, obviously, project, and it's built from age 0 or maybe before and until forever. And I don't think there's anything particular or like 1, 2, 3 things to do. But I think as a general approach, there needs to be respect between people, and any other way that we can think of how we build trust with another person, whether it's a colleague, a friend, or whoever. We just keep our promises, we respect them, we're being honest, and we're trying to be open. I think it's the same with kids. And if we have that, we can talk about anything, including suicide.
I agree. And I think that, if you're going to sit and talk to your kid, then put your phone away. Don't answer the phone when you're talking to them. And another really big one is try not to problem solve with them, right? They come to you and like our immediate parent mode is to be like, okay, this is what we're going to do. But they don't always want that. Sometimes they just want to talk. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Somebody said validate. Whatever it is that they say, reflect it back at them and say, wow, that must have been really hard, right? That's all. Or do you mean this? And that allows them to be like, no, I didn't mean that. I mean this. So be in conversation. If you're going to have the conversation with your kid, you really want to focus on it. Be present. Be curious. Let them know that, things that they have to say are insightful, or that they are teaching you. I learn every day from my clients. Every day. Any client that sits with me, I learn something. So we have that ability to learn from our kids as much as they do from us. And that is showing them that level of respect. But I agree with Valery. I think it's something that you build with them. And if you can't talk to one of your children in that way, it doesn't mean that you're a failure. Not all of us have that connection with each kid. Not every kid wants to have that kind of talk with a parent.
Also, I want to add that we have to look at the bigger picture. You can't expect your kids to come and talk to you if there's not a context to the relationship that involves normal being together. So you got to plan in advance and make sure you're doing things like hanging out together in the kitchen, going to shop together just for groceries. Hey, you want to come in the car with me? I'm going to pick up a few things. Why don't you come? You'll help me pack the groceries. Yeah. Things like that lead to just natural time together, so that when it's time for them to say something, you'll already be there in their life. You can't expect them to come to you if you haven't planned in advance by weaving yourself into their life in a natural way. And that takes planning, and that takes effort, but it has to come naturally.
I would just add something that I've learned in my work at Crossroads, which is the importance of accepting your child and them knowing that you accept them for who they are. There was one point, I think I was making a video, and I asked a bunch of participants, the most meaningful things that happened at Crossroads. I was sure they were going to tell us about one difficult situation or another situation where Crossroads came to save them. And fascinatingly, one after the other, they said, they accept me for who I am. And I think that shouldn't be understated, the importance of a child knowing that regardless if you accept every part of them, but that you accept them and you love them for who they are. I think that's a central point as well. Okay. I don't have all the details connected to this case, but I'm going to throw out something, realizing that I'm sure there's a lot of other details. How would you recommend dealing with an 11-year-old who threatens to take a knife and stab himself? Is this considered active? He's never done it, but he threatens it multiple times. Again, I know it's a challenging question, and there's not so much context and details, but with what I shared, what would you be able to offer?
Okay, I guess I'll grab that first. I often tell my parents that I work with that it is important to explain to their children that suicide is a medical emergency. And that when kids say something like that, they need to be taken seriously, as we've said many times, but they also need to be sat down, looked in the eye and said, listen, people trying to kill themselves is a medical emergency, and I am not a doctor. So if you're telling me that you really want to kill yourself now, we need to go to the emergency room and get a doctor to see you immediately, because just like if you said to me, oh, my stomach really hurts, I can't breathe, and you don't know, is it appendicitis or not? You'll take them to the emergency room because you're afraid it's an appendicitis and you can't make that distinction on your own. The child needs to understand that this isn't a threat, this isn't a behavioral issue. That kind of wording is a medical emergency. I find that when kids get that kind of response from parents, it settles them down. It de-escalates the power struggle, and it makes them realize that their parents are taking charge and are helping them. So if you say, are you trying to tell me that you're upset about something? Are you trying to tell me that you're angry? Or do you feel like you want to kill yourself? Because that feeling is a medical emergency. Then we need to get a doctor's help immediately. But if you offer them other wordings that can give them a chance to express their pain while still feeling like you're listening to them, it can de-escalate the situation. Because really, I can't give you a statistic, but in most cases, an 11-year-old with a knife is not really wanting to kill themselves and actually is trying to say, I'm furious and I need you to know that. In most cases, it is rare for an 11-year-old to actually be suicidal. Does it happen? Of course, but far more common is for an 11-year-old to feel overwhelmed by an emotion and not have the tools to express it.
Yeah, I would say that the other thing is that if they do it multiple times, you want to remember that talking to your child in the moment that they're saying I'm going to take a knife and cut myself or hurt myself. Do what Jennie said, and then later, when things are calm, that's when you want to have a further discussion with them and say, you and I need to come up with a better sentence that you could say to me that can be your signal that you feel terrible and there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing that you can say and you don't know where to go. So let's come up with it together and work with your kid on coming up with a sentence that's just as upsetting, that is escalating to the place where they can really give you that message, but that's not threatening something that needs to be taken to a hospital.
I would use the word, when you say to them, we have to talk about a better way to say this, I would use the word safer. Let's think of a safer way to do this, because really it's not just about that kid. And of course, it's very much about that kid, but it isn't only. It's very, very dysregulating for siblings to have a child in the house who, when he gets upset, picks up a knife, and it becomes contagious. And parents will say to me, now that Avrami has been doing this, guess what? Now Shlomo's doing it too. And we see that contagion in the house of that kind of outburst. Again, not contagion of suicidal thinking, contagion of this kind of violent behavior. Yeah. So it's important to redirect it, not just for the safety of the child, but for the safety of the environment of the home.
Right. I would also say that when you said the word dysregulating, that's a big deal, right? When a kid doesn't know how to regulate their own emotions, then what they do is they escalate. First they say, I want to go outside, and you don't let them. And then they say, I'm going to hit, they hit their sibling, right? And that escalated behavior, probably within this 11-year-old, there was escalated behavior that ended with, I'm going to grab a knife and hurt myself. So it's a communication. It's what I was talking about earlier. What's underneath that? And it's trying to figure out how you can recognize when your child is saying that first sentence and trying to get it as close to that initial call for help, right? That before it escalates to knife. Okay. Robbie?
Yeah, I wanted to just add a small point there, which is something that unfortunately we hear the language a lot, in our work. What I tell my staff and I tell parents all the time is we take language literally, regardless of what we know the chances are. I think Caryn was talking before about most situations aren't going to lead to a suicide, regardless of what I know statistically. And regardless of what I believe, I think it's very important to take language literally, because language is the way people communicate in the world. And if we, take that, literally, I think people will, if it's not real, if it is real language, so then we're doing a good thing. If it's not real language, so then the language over time, I think like was expressed right now, would begin to change. Okay, give me a sec. Okay. The question is, what happens in the home when a parent is going through a deep depression? They can't handle themselves, let alone be an example for the children. Maybe let me just reframe the question as, how to support kids in a home where either you or a partner, your partner is mentally in distress?
I think it's a broader question to what do we do with kids, let's say, headspace, that live in households that, let's say, are far from optimal. And sometimes the parents are partners for change and we bring them in. And sometimes, unfortunately, they're not. And I think part of the work with a teenager ways, I think, to adapt to a situation. That's his life. His father, let's say, if that's the father that you mentioned, has a clinical depression. That's what he knows. That's what he needs to deal with. That's part of his life story. And I think we need to help him. I think one thing that is really important in the household, if we're talking from the inside, not in therapy, is to explain to them, or I don't know, explain is the right word, but to communicate to them, maybe to try to communicate to them that it's not their fault, right? Because kids sometimes think it's their fault that one of the parents acts the way they do. And it's not the only way to be in the world, or the only way to be an adult, because I think kids, and it sounds like paradoxical almost, but I think when we grow up and we look at our parents, for many years we think that this is it. Like, if you're an adult, you're basically depressed. Like, it sounds paradoxical, I know, but many kids have those narratives built up on what they see. So I would emphasize, again, those two messages. One, it's really not your fault. It's his own life. That's what's going on. It's really tough on all of us. It's really tough on you. But that's just your story. And the second thing, it's not the only way to be an adult. Hopefully, you'll be a different adult.
I also think it's important to say to them, it's okay for you to be happy, even if your parent is not. You're not betraying your parent. Like, you're not betraying Abba, or you're not betraying Ima by being happy yourself and bringing that happiness in. And, all of us hold a lot of different emotions together. I always talk about the fact that we have conflicting emotions inside of us all the time. Sometimes at a Shiva, you'll find people laughing, right? Because it goes together. The sadness and the happiness goes together. And even though Abba is depressed, he's not depressed all the time, and he feels happy for you and joy for you and proud of you. And he's not always able to show it, but it is there, and you are definitely seeing one part of it. But remember that all of us hold all of those things, and you can be kind of sad for Abba at the same time as being happy and living your life. And the best thing we can do as parents is to allow you to live your best life. And no matter what's going on with us, your parents, you should understand that your job as a kid is to live your best life. As a person who, has been a therapist for teens for years, I can tell you that I really believe that a teenager has the ability to affect the life in a family, right? The family life. I believe that if you can empower a teenager to understand how strong they are, how courageous they are, how brave they are, how they have the ability to live their life in a certain way, and then it's like throwing a pebble into a pond. The more they're able to live and live the best they can live, then it will have ripple effect within the house. And that will bring good things into the house that they have control over. They have control over themselves, but they do not have control over other people, including their parents.
I just want to circle back to the parent role in a situation like that. But based on the wording of the question, what is something like what does a parent do if they themselves are depressed and they can't help regulate their child? Even a depressed parent has one very strong avenue to keep themselves in the parental role, and that's to ask for help for their family. And so you can make one phone call to the school psychologist, the rabbi of the community, one point person, and say, help, I'm drowning. I need you to help me identify a case manager to get help for my children. And if you can do that as a parent, you have parented your child, and you have been in the parent role in a way that saves the family, even though you might not feel like you can be the conduit directly of that help. But by asking for the help, you've done the same as you would do if your kid has appendicitis and brought them to a doctor, right? You're bringing help to your child in the best way that you can. And so it's very important to make that one phone call to the person who can take charge. And really, thank God, everybody on this Zoom is living in a community where there are surely people involved who can be called upon to help in a situation where a family's in distress. The key is not to be ashamed to make that phone call. That's really the key. And I hope that the desire to help your children will allow you to overcome any kind of discomfort that you have in making that phone call, because it's the bravest thing that you can do.
There was a question here about terminology, about the concept of the term committed suicide. It says, I hear the professionals using the term committed suicide. My understanding is that this terminology is no longer used because it implies the person did something bad. I know that the families of victims of suicide very much object to that term. I'm curious if any of you have dealt with that terminology and semantic, and how much of it is semantics and how much is it's really fundamental.
I think it's funny, not funny, that's the wrong word, but it's poignant, because I think we find ourselves using old terminology because we're old. And so we fall back to old language, but it's absolutely true. The more we can say things like died of suicide, the more powerful the message that suicide is an illness and not something that anybody should be blamed for. So it's true. Point well taken. Absolutely. And the more accurate we can be in our language, the more successful we'll be in transmitting the message that suicide is not anyone's fault. It's something that needs help, but it's not a choice that people make in the same sense that they make choices about other things. Absolutely true.
Okay. Second to last question. We're going to end at 9:30. Second to last question, which is connected, but it definitely opens up a different area of discussion. How does one deal with teens who aren't necessarily suicidal, but they're using drugs in dangerous ways or involved in other self-harm, and may even say they don't care if they accidentally, overdose? I'm not sure if that means that they're not suicidal, but but leave out even the last part, dealing with teens who aren't expressing, any type of suicidality, but they're involved in, self-harming behaviors.
Well, I think we know that there are different signs and or risk factors to suicide, and everything you basically just mentioned are all risk factors for suicidal behavior. And in fact, I think self-harm is considered by some suicidal behavior. We can maybe not now, but it's a debate when it is suicidal or not. But at the very least, everything you mentioned is a sign for concern. I'm not talking about smoking a joint here and there. I think that's maybe not, but what you mentioned is serious drug use and self-harm. That's concerning in itself and a risk factor for suicidality, and might be considered self-harm by some as somewhat active suicidality potential, depending on the case, of course. So it's all very concerning, and I think it needs immediate professional attention.
I would send them to Crossroads. Personally.
Definitely. I will do that too.
That's what I would do. But just
not to Headspace, by the way. Headspace doesn't work with suicidal kids.
Not Headspace, just Crossroads. Yeah, but I mean, I think that look, I think we when I talked about passive suicidal gestures and things like that, certainly drug use in certain ways can be. It's not all drug use. There are kids who smoke a lot of pot. Is not the same thing as using different drugs that can cause death immediately, right? There's different kinds of drugs, so don't try not to put them all into the same basket. And it's also, it's a lot of things all together, right? It's never taking one thing and deciding that that's the thing, right? You want to know, are they functioning? Are they going to school? Do they have friends? Do they care about things? Do they have passions? Do they have hobbies? Are they doing drugs, right? If you look at it instead of the disease model, if you look at it under the behavioral model of addiction, then it's if there's a motivational hierarchy where drugs have become the most important thing on that hierarchy, you really need to get them help, right? But if it's not, then it's about trying to figure out what's underneath it. What's going on with them? What can you offer them? What can they do that is going to give them the same feeling of being relieved? Drugs are often something that the kids do because they are feeling pain. When they do drugs, they don't feel that pain. So then if that's where we're starting from, then the question is, little by little, with patience and trying to figure out how to get them help, you're trying to figure out what is causing them that pain, or what is it internal, is it external, and trying to help them through it. But it's not a simple answer, and it could be like its own evening. With a different panel, right? Or we could do the same panel, but take an hour and a half to talk about this because it's a big topic and it's a hard topic.
I will just add, though, that I think the wording of the question was if they're not expressing suicidality and yet engaging in self-harming behaviors. And I think what we need to do is reorganize our thoughts around the word expressing. Teenagers express things more often, not through words, but through behaviors and through activities and through the friends they choose. Every action that a teenager does is an expression of something, and it's our job to listen to the message that they're sending us through these behaviors and through these actions. So what they say with the words is almost the least important aspect. And really what we want to be looking at as we look at what our teenagers are feeling and trying to say to us is their behaviors. And the truth is, you know, if we turn that around, it's the same for us. They look at our behaviors. They're not listening to what we're saying as much as looking at how we're acting and how we're interacting with them and what we're modeling for them. So it works in both directions.
Okay, last question. First of all, this has been super meaningful, informative. As I said, we're going to follow up with all the participants and send a number of resources as well after the event. I'm going to end off with this question. It might be some review, but I think it's a meaningful last question. What's one thing you can tell parents to help them feel capable and empowered?
Okay, I'll jump in if nobody else will. At the end of the day, if you love your children, they will feel that in some way. So we've talked about a lot of scary things tonight, but really, you're all good parents. We are doing our best, and with everything that we said, children know when we're being genuine and we're trying our best, and you can relax and rely on that in tough moments. That desire to be there for them will shine through even at the times that feel like you're not there for them in the best way. They know that you love them. So I think we have to hold on to that optimism even in the tough times.
I think, you know, I think that the idea of holding on to connection and seeing your children and saying things out loud, and don't try not to keep them in your kishkes. Say you love them, say that you see them, say that you care about them. And every one of you is capable of doing that. We are all capable of simplifying it, right? Try not to make it into something that's too big. Simplify it into these small sort of basic things that you weave into your everyday. And give yourself a break when you make a mistake. Give yourself a break when you have a bad parenting moment, because we all have them. And look at your kid, be genuine, be honest, admit your mistakes, let them know, laugh with them about anything and everything, but be with them.
For me, kind of the word that comes up is respect. I think respecting our own inner world and our children's inner world. And even if those inner worlds have something as scary as suicidality, I think if we're able to communicate to our children, to our patients, that we really respect whatever they're feeling, I think it's a very good start to anything else.
Okay, wonderful. I'll just, I think, even repeat, I think that one of the first things I learned, Caryn, when I came to Crossroads, is that the teens totally pick up on your sincerity. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how different you are. If you're sincere and you care, they're going to feel it and they're going to appreciate it. That was a really important lesson that I learned that I would share as well. I would just want to, take a moment to thank Jennie and Valery and Caryn, and frankly, just acknowledge all the parents who came out tonight, dedicated, an hour and a half to a really a challenging topic, a scary topic, but a very important and timely one. We're going to follow up, with a we're going to follow up with an email to everyone who registered with some resources, and both about Crossroads and then the community at large. And as I said earlier, if you have a teen or a young adult, there's a lot of resources out there. Not everyone has access to all the resources, but please always know that there is a place called Crossroads that you can reach out to. Our contact information is in the chat. We'll follow up as well. And we're here to offer every possible support that we can. So again, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our parents. Thank you to Deborah and the Crossroads staff for helping make this happen.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.